What if everything you thought you knew about autism was based on myths? Consider this: billions of dollars spent, countless lives impacted, and yet the foundation of it all might not even exist. By the end of this video, you'll see how one shocking myth about autism sets off a domino effect, creating 4 more myths that shape how we understand autism today. And you won't believe what all this points to in the end. It's a revelation that could completely change how you see not only autism, but the entire framework of mental health. Autism. It's a word that carries a lot of weight, assumptions and beliefs. It's a subject that can elicit strong emotional reactions in certain people. But how much of what you think you know about autism is based on facts, and how much is based on assumptions? In this video, we're breaking down 5 of the most shocking myths about autism. And trust me, these aren't just misconceptions. They reveal deep flaws in how we view the spectrum, diagnosis, and even what it means to be autistic. If you stick with me until the end of this video, you'll uncover a truth that might not only surprise you, but will challenge everything you thought you knew about mental health diagnosis. Let's start with the first myth. The first myth is the most foundational one. It's upon this myth that most of the other autism myths are built. It's the belief that autism is a possessable entity. It's treated like something you have, as though it's an object inside of you, like a virus or tumor. But here's the shocking truth. No scientific evidence has ever proven that autism exists as any kind of physical entity. There's no test, no scan, no blood marker that can conclusively identify autism. Even in the most severe cases, you can't identify and locate autism in any part of the body with any kind of scanning equipment. So think about it. If you can't see, hear, smell, touch or taste autism, and you can't find it with any kind of instrument, how can you possibly know it exists as something inside of you? Well, the absolute truth is you can't. Now, some people might argue, yeah, you can see autism, you can see how they behave differently. You're just seeing the behaviours, you're not seeing what causes the behaviour. Autism is diagnosed purely upon the subjective observation and interpretation of behaviour, which can vary widely from person to person. Now, all of this raises one very important question. If autism doesn't exist as a physically possessable entity, how can researchers possibly claim that they found the genetic link to it? I mean, think about it. They're searching for the DNA code for something that's never been conclusively proven to actually physically exist. It's like searching for the DNA for creativity or happiness. Doesn't all this sound a little bit backward to you? This isn't just a theoretical issue. It has real-world implications into how we understand, research, and even treat autism. So let me quickly explain the absurdity of all this in another way. So imagine we're sitting in a living room across from each other, and in between us is a small coffee table. And I tell you, in the middle of that coffee table is a miniature pink elephant drinking coffee. Now, you can't see, hear, smell, touch or taste that elephant, and you can't detect it with any kind of instrument, but it exists. Now, how can you possibly know that it exists? Well, the truth is you can't. You have to trust me. Now, the sensible question to ask would be, if you can't see, hear, smell, touch or taste it, and you can't detect it with any kind of instrument, how can I possibly know it exists? And the absolute truth is, I can't. I'm either making it up, or I've trusted something somebody else has told me. Now, this example might seem totally absurd to you, and that you would never believe me if I told you something like that. Yet practically the whole world has no problem believing when a person in a white coat and a stethoscope stands up and says something exists that you can't see, hear, smell, touch or taste, or detect with any kind of instrument. Now, keep all this in mind as we dive deeper, because it sets the stage for all of the other myths. So if autism isn't a physically possessable entity, then what is it? Well, this is where the second myth comes in. The second myth is the idea of autistic traits. We often hear about traits like difficulty with social interactions, repetitive behaviours or sensory sensitivities as being unique to autistic people. But the truth is, there are no behaviours or traits displayed by autistic individuals that cannot also be found in the general population to some degree or another. Sure, some of these traits may be more pronounced in autistic individuals, but they're not exclusive to them. For example, Hasn't everyone felt overwhelmed at one time or another due to excessive noise, or felt the need for some sort of routines in their life? These are just common human experiences, not exclusive traits tied up in some sort of autistic profile. When you begin to see this, you realize that the dividing line between autistic and non-autistic is far blurrier than we've been led to believe. If autism isn't a physically possessable entity, and its traits aren't exclusive, then what separates autistic people from non-autistic people? This brings us to the third myth. This myth is one of the most pervasive. It's the belief that there is a clear and distinctive dividing line between neurotypical and autistic people. Well, that dividing line, it's completely made up. It absolutely does not exist in nature. It's a construct created by humans to categorize behaviors into neat little boxes, often for the sake of convenience rather than accuracy. If you think about it, all of human behavior exists on a spectrum. Everyone has quirks, sensitivities, or preferences. Some people may fall closer to one end of that spectrum than the other, but the idea that there's a solid dividing line between normal and autistic is just that, an idea. It's not an absolute fact. This has enormous implications. Think about how this arbitrary line has been used to justify everything from medical interventions to societal exclusion. And this leads into the fourth myth. The fourth myth is the belief that the autism spectrum represents a completely separate category of people. But here's the reality. The autism spectrum isn't a box. It's just the far end of a continuum of behaviors and traits that spans the entire human population. What we call autism is just the extreme end of traits that everyone possesses to some degree. Think about sensory sensitivities. Some people feel mildly bothered by bright lights, while others experience extreme discomfort. It's all part of the same continuum, yet society draws this artificial line and says everything beyond this point is autism. This artificial separation creates a false us versus them mentality, which isolates and marginalizes autistic individuals. But if we shift our perspective to see the spectrum as part of a larger continuum, we open the door to understanding and inclusion. And this brings us to the last myth. Finally, we arrive at the myth that an autism diagnosis is conclusive. Here's the problem. Autism diagnosis relies exclusively upon the subjective observation and interpretation of behavior. Clinicians observe behaviors and decide whether they meet the criteria for autism. But this process is far from objective. Two clinicians can observe the same person and come to two completely different conclusions. You can effectively walk into one clinic, be diagnosed as autistic, walk down the road to another clinic and be told that no, you're not. I mean, if this thing exists, you either have it or you don't. But you might argue, well, one was just right and one was just wrong. But how do you determine which is right and which is wrong? You can't take a test to prove which person is right and which one is wrong. Sure, you might be able to bring in a more experienced clinician and they can decide which one is right and which one is wrong. But again, it's just their opinion. They can't give a test to work out which is right and which is wrong. They're just giving their professional opinion, and an opinion is just their best guess. What makes this even more concerning is that the diagnostic criteria used to define autism in the DSM, or Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, is also created through the subjective observation and interpretation of behaviours. There's no physical evidence or biological markers guiding this criteria, just human interpretations of the behaviours deemed to be autistic. And remember, if autism has never been proven to exist as a possessable entity, what exactly is being diagnosed here? This isn't meant to invalidate the experiences of autistic people. It's meant to point out the level of uncertainty built into the diagnosis itself. If the whole foundation of the diagnostic process is built upon subjectivity, how conclusive can a diagnosis actually be? And even more to the point, how much damage is being caused by making life-altering decisions based upon a foundation of complete subjectivity? So what does all this mean? Well, let's connect the dots. Autism isn't a possessable entity. Its traits aren't exclusive. The dividing line between neurotypical and autistic is imaginary. The spectrum is just the extreme end of a continuum of behaviours and traits that spans the entire population, and a diagnosis is far from conclusive. But here's the kicker. Autism isn't the only diagnosis built on such shaky foundations. Not a single one of the 297 listed mental disorders in the DSM have ever been proven to exist as possessable entities. There's no blood tests, brain scans, or biological markers that can be used to identify a single one of these disorders anywhere within the body. If they actually existed as possessable entities, you would think by now, after all this time and with all our advanced technology, we would at least be able to prove at least one of them. Perhaps we're looking in the wrong direction entirely. What if instead of searching for something that's broken, we instead considered the possibility that perhaps autistic brains have merely evolved differently, offering unique strengths and perspectives that enrich the human experience? What if the perceived differences aren't flaws but are adaptations that serve a purpose we've yet to fully understand? What are your thoughts? Is it time for us to rethink everything we've been told about autism and mental health? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this video has opened your mind, then share it with someone who needs to hear this. Together we can change the narrative. Now, if you've found these myths intriguing and you want to explore the implications of them further, then check out this video up here. And if you want to learn about a theory of autism that offers a far more empowering perspective than the current mental health model does, then check out this one up here.